Hi and welcome to my YouTube channel. This talk is part one of a four-part series called Mysticism. It's a general introduction to mysticism and spirituality of all sorts of religions. It's a general introduction. I'd be curious what you think of it. I always find it interesting to take off your narrow mindset and widen the horizon on what is out there. Life is more than just food, drink, sleep, and procreation. I'm curious if this talk inspires you as much as the subject of mysticism inspired me. Have fun with it. I'll start by asking you a question. It's very specific and deep, even though it's quite simple. The question is, would you like to learn something? Or do you only want to be affirmed in what you already know? That's actually a good question. It's a question you can pose to your whole life. You can ask it in every situation, every problem, in each new step of life. Am I here to really advance, to truly learn something? Or do I just want affirmation for what I already know? The funny thing is, as kids we start out with the freedom to learn. You don't yet have a finished concept, but you first say, if I learn something new, then whatever I learn could maybe be wrong, and I'll just accept the new thing. That's how kids think. But then, I don't know, at the age of 15, 16, 17, 20, 25, somewhere around that time, it's strange, the world becomes more set in place. Basically with every human. And this worldview is at risk to become something completed, which can almost block us from new experiences and questioning. Do you know this? The normal drive, the normal tendency of us humans is unfortunately not to say, whatever the truth is, I'm searching. And whatever new things come, if I have to change myself, I'll change and keep learning. That's not how it is. I actually read a book a few months ago, which was famous in the 80s. It's called People of the Lie, by a psychologist named Scott Peck. And Scott Peck studied people who weren't mentally ill but quite normal. However, he says, if you look closely, people are evil in how they treat each other in relationships. It's actually evil and destructive. And he asks, what actually is evil? And he comes to a point. It really perplexed me. He says evilness and a severe neurotic disorder both have a similar structure. And the structure is the refusal to stand reality as it is and to mature through real life. So in other words, I'd rather build a construct that doesn't threaten me so I stay safe than to look at the pain of reality in the eye. Every worldview, every philosophy, including every religion, can become a closed-off system, which means you no longer learn anything new. That's quite astounding. See, I'll draw a sketch here. This here is, say, a worldview. It could be a philosophical worldview, or a scientific, or a theological. But now, under each worldview, there are also experiences. Experiences that are in relationship with this worldview. So the worldview, for example, says there is a God, or the worldview says there is no God. And then the experiences can also be something completely different, like I had some spiritual experiences, or I felt so much bad luck in my life, I can't imagine that there is a God. Those are two different topics that are connected. I'm speaking in this presentation series about a fascinating, puzzling, mysterious trait of us humans. And we will refer to it during this series with the word mysticism. It will become more clear over the course of the evening what mysticism is. But first, fundamentally, we have a worldview. and are always at risk of cutting our worldview off from experience. And mysticism is the opposite direction. There are even atheists who say, with some experiences, if anything spiritual that people experience doesn't fit my worldview, then it just doesn't exist. They then have all sorts of theories to say, well, the person is mentally ill, or took drugs, or they just made it up. The tough part is that you can't just explain away the experience of all human history. It's just there. And you have to do something with it. And I mean with all sorts of eras of human history, different continents, at all developmental levels, from, quote, primitive tribes to highly developed civilizations, across all religions, humans have somehow experienced the supernatural. You can insert what you want, that someone appeared to them in a dream, that they sensed they saw an angel or something, that a dead person appeared, and so on. Such experiences exist. And every human with their theory, every human with their worldview is confronted with the question, how do they deal with all of this? Now, we're dealing during this series with the topic of mysticism. And mysticism probably comes from, no one knows for sure, probably from the Greek word myein, which means to shut your eyes. Shut your eyes to look inward. Mysticism exists in all religions of the world. And we'll dare to attempt today to look at mysticism across several different religions, in order to find out what could be patterns that keep appearing, what are base questions we keep coming across, and what are the base problems that scream for an answer. We're going to try. This will very much only be a sketch. I'm also no excellent expert in all these areas, but we're going to attempt to ask the question, what even is out there? Where do we humans get the idea that there is the supernatural? And how should we deal with it? And I propose that you can first of all simply say mysticism is more to go towards this. So more experience than theory. Practically all worldviews, especially all religions, have a certain theory. For example, the theory that the Christian God is three in one, or in Buddhism, that there is a nirvana, that there is reincarnation. Those are teachings that are believed. And now mysticism goes more the path of saying it's about experience. So what did you experience with all this rather than what do you know from a theory? Classic example, I bring you a quote that comes from Zen Buddhism. I don't know if you are aware, but all Buddhists strive towards enlightenment. And enlightenment, or the Satori, is nothing you can read in a book. Nobody can explain it to you. You have to experience it yourself. And a famous saying, for example, by Imakita Kösen, a Zen monk, says, "A million sutras are as a candle before the sun." So sutra is a recited holy text. And he says, you can do that 1,000,000 times compared to experiencing enlightenment. It's like a candle before the sun. So basically, experience is more important than theory. So there's a way of experience, and there isn't only theory. Then the next thing across all religions, in Jewish mysticism with Christian mystics, Muslim mystics, you have a base pattern that runs through, and that is inward instead of outward. Inward instead of outward. Humans have an intuitive sense that true being is more on the inside than outside. I'll show you a quote from one of the oldest mystical texts that there is, written about 300 BC, Tao Te Ching, very important in all the East. He, for example, says, Without going far, one can understand the whole world. Without looking out of the window, one can grasp the ways of heaven. The further one wanders, the less one understands. Therefore, the wise understands without going far. He sees without looking. The idea is that the essence is on the inside. You don't need to go far on the outside. The key is on the inside. Next topic that runs through mysticism. In Christian mysticism, as in other religions, and it's remarkable, it's the emphasis that there is a path, and not just a membership in something. You could say, you're now a member here of a church or a member of a club. And mystics emphasize more you need to go on a journey. You're not just a member for life and it's done, but it's a path. It continues. Journey instead of membership. Let me read you a sentence here from a very famous Christian mystic, John of the Cross. One sentence prior, he says to the woman he's mentoring spiritually, the more you separate yourself from worldly things, the more you draw near to the heavenly things and the more you find in God. So clearly the idea is there is a path where you move away from outward things of this world to come close to God. It's not one time you become a member and that's it, but it's a process. It's a keep going. And this continued journey means, or has the goal, that something changes. Unlike classic way of world religions, mysticism is more about transformation than following rules. This is important. There is an outward framework of religions. In all religions where it's about following rules, you need to wash yourself here, you should eat that, you can't eat that, at this time you do this, at that time you do that. Mysticism emphasizes the transformation on the inside more than the outside actions, outward rule following. I'll call it transformation instead of rules, rule following. And finally, here comes one of those great quotes which I love, namely from the Zohar. That's a mystical book in Judaism. It plays a big role in the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. The Kabbalah has a very body-focused mysticism. For example, it writes, don't be shocked. I'll probably shock you a few times today. It's no big deal. You guys are doing great. Very physical, without shame, the Zohar, Jewish mystics write, and notice that the hour when man and woman find themselves in the love union in right way, that is, towards holiness, then the human becomes complete and can be called one without blemish of his being. So he says, God made men and women as a unit, and that only really becomes true when they two sleep together. Okay, what does it have to do with religion? Mysticism says everything. Because mysticism is always holistic. So it also has to do with flesh and blood. This is a common thread also in Zen Buddhism, where the people meditate a lot. In yoga, it's a lot about how you do physical exercises, because the mindset is, it's always about the whole body, not just the mind. I'll write here body instead of mind. Technically not true, you would have to say holistic instead of only the mind, but you know what I mean. Now the key is this. These things here, these emphases, these mystical themes exist all over the world in all religions. And it's neither all good nor all bad. One of my main teaching goals for tonight is to sharpen your, how should I say, your ability to discern things, and at the same time to overcome your or our superficiality a bit. Because sometimes we might want to say in that realm, all is only good. Most times it's the space we ourselves are hanging out. So in that space all is great, and over there all is bad. But it's not as simple as that. I asked you in the beginning if you want to learn something today or if you just want to be right. The feeling of only wanting confirmation in where I already am is deceptive. This realm of spiritual experience, where people set on a journey, where people want to discover something, isn't black and white. It's not just always good, and it's not always bad. First of all, it's not all bad. A human life without any of the spiritual things is a completely miserable life. And dear Christians, you also can't go through this world and say anywhere people have a spiritual experience outside of Christianity is automatically bad. It's not so simple. The closer you deal with individual experiences, you realize, wow, those are things that are very close to what exists in Christianity. But in some points, maybe not so close after all. It's not that easy. But also you can't get through the world and say wherever people open themselves up and just become empty and, I don't know, develop themselves, it's good. Because that's not true. There's also some pretty bad stuff. The hippie movement in the 1960s set out to open themselves up to all sorts of things. And there was a defining moment early on in the hippie movement where the Beatles went to India, very colorful image. Here you see the Beatles with their then wives at the feet of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, one of the founders of Transcendental Meditation. And this whole youth culture was totally drawn in by this mystical way of meditation in India. And shortly after this picture was taken, the Beatles left India offended and shocked because they found out that Maharishi had something not so good going on with a woman, and somehow got a lot of money through it. It was the first real shock of this young hippie movement to realize, wow, just because someone has mystical experiences doesn't mean that everything is good. And it will be one of the questions we have to deal with today. Yeah, how can you tell that what a true, authentic way is, and where does it get weird? Even more shocking, we have to call it by name. Everything that happened in Germany during the Third Reich wasn't void of a certain mystical note. Hitler himself maybe not, he was likely the cold power guy. But at the foundation of his elite unit, the SS, there was among others the strange man with the wonderful name of Karl Maria Willigut. And Karl Maria Willigut thought, well, Willigut wasn't a great Nazi name, so he gave himself the name Weistor. Tor comes from the Germanic Norse god, and Weis means the knowledgeable, the wise, the Thor-wise. And he put together this mystical worldview from Norse paganism to Nepalese Indo-Germanic sun cults. And he was a direct impulse giver, especially for the development of the SS under Heinrich Himmler. So there was mysticism. It was we're experiencing things with the primal powers of the German people, which was totally not good mysticism. You see, it's rough terrain. There's also a lot of people, you will notice, they start dealing with these topics, mysticism. And a few years later, you meet them again and they're so weird. Ever experienced that? Because the question is so obvious. If I rely on experiences and not the worldview, okay, but experiences are quite subjective. Maybe I'm just imagining things. Maybe I'll become dumb in the process. It's a tough subject, but one we cannot avoid. In the following, I'll play with the number 5 today, to give you 5 paths. I have 5 titles, and each of the titles has 5 points. The first one you already successfully passed, because that was the 5 things that mysticism emphasizes. So, experience over theory, body instead of just mind, journey instead of one-time member, and so on. You heard it. Now I want to give you a brief overview of the way I call it 5 mystical traditions that exist worldwide. I tell you this stuff so we can see clearly what are the themes that run through everything and where there are things that are totally different. I want to start by looking at the first family. I'll call this the Eastern paths. So things like Zen and Yoga. Briefly, what's the difference? Yoga is mainly a teaching that is common in India and originated from Hinduism and has a lot to do with physical asceticism. You fast, only eat certain things, it's an ascetic teaching. Zen teaching originates more from Buddhism and blossomed mostly in Japan. And originally probably came from China. And in Zen it's more about achieving a complete emptiness from everything. If you want, at risk of being too superficial to give these Eastern paths a title, then I'd suggest a title right now. I will give each of the 5 paths the possible title, taking the risks that it's total oversimplification. But I would give Zen and Yoga the title, Practice Towards the Non-Me. Might sound strange to us. Practice towards the non-me. The idea in Eastern paths is everything that separates you from the truth or from God or real things is your ego, your me. And so you have to somehow overcome that. Through asceticism, by becoming empty, practicing mindfulness or meditation. So it has a lot to do with practice. The person is active, they do something. But the goal is to become empty, a non-me. Let me read a classic quote by Tao Te Ching. The wise steps back, and that's exactly why he's so far ahead. He gives up his self, and that's why he remains. Because he forgets his self, he can find his self. That could also be a classic Zen quote. So in Yoga, very clear, in Hinduism, very clear, ego is a deception that must be overcome in order to find enlightenment. Eastern paths. Next, Jewish mysticism.
Judentum hat
Judaism has, just like any other religion, a mystical part. And this mystical part is either called Hasidism, it comes from the Hebrew word Hasid, which means pious, or Kabbalah. The Kabbalah are a collection of, I would say, mystical texts. Some also cross over into the realm of the magic. There are also some dubious and odd things in it. But the basic idea of Jewish mysticism is actually more holistic. I would like to now read you a story from the book, The Stories of Hasidism. Martin Buber collected these tales. And I find this one of the clearest stories where it's about Jewish mysticism. I'll read it to you. The rabbi once asked his son, "What do you pray with?" The son understood the question as, what perspective does he focus his prayers on? He replied, "I pray with the saying, all pride should bow before you." Then he asked the father, "Well, father, what do you pray with?" And the rabbi replied, "With the board and the bench." So the idea is a grounded, day-to-day mysticism, where everything in life directly borders the eternal. I'll call this mystical movement the Messianic daily life. Messianic in Judaism isn't only that the Messiah will come one day, but also that everything is arranged so that it's in line with the upper world, the rule of God. But here too, the aspect of doing it yourself is very strong. By observing the Torah and loving the Torah, it is achieved. I'll call it Messianic daily life. That's the second of the 5 paths I want to show you. The third path is, I almost said, not so familiar to us, but I'm not sure if that's true. I'm only saying that because with this third path, it's very important to understand it because it's becoming more popular these days. Namely, it started already in the early 1800s. There's an intellectual history we call Romanticism. And in the Romantic period, people start to fall in love with nature. A lot of the first nature-loving poetry emerges. People go out to the fields, and in the forest there is the kingdom of heaven. And the buzzing bee is a revelation to me because everything is filled with the divine. That was classic, even back with the late Goethe. With Goethe you already see things like that, but Romantic literature is full of it. And since then it's actually been a growing movement under the surface of our culture, a mystical movement I will call nature mysticism. And it's actually a pagan mysticism. And I'll call it this because pagan still partially carries a negative connotation. I'll call it nature mysticism. It's actually quite popular, including with people who don't want to do with Christianity or even with official religion. But they want to then be buried in a forest cemetery or have their ashes thrown into the ocean, so we enter back into the circle of everything. And this thinking that nature is something sacred, that nature has something mystical about it, and we have sinned against nature. That sounds almost like the political program of some parties. But that we have sinned against nature and need to return to this all-unit, that actually has a mystical component, which you also find in many nature religions. And here again, I'm not saying I know each nature religion extremely well, but it seems to me if you were to look at Aborigines in Australia, the native tribes in North America, or even here in Germany with the Celts, or I just came back from Iceland, the ancient Icelandic religion or so, you have a strong connection to nature. And somehow this sense that nature itself has some holiness to it. I'll read to you from a poem. It's called "And Manitou Created the World," so a Native American poem. It says, "The roses burst into flame, the meadows white and dark red, the robins filled the summer days with their song, the white fish showed their flashing silver tails in lakes and creeks, the deer buck lay flat and ate from the grassland. Our stores are full, our medicine strong, our weapons used up, and our spirits were glad. Kichi Manitou has been kind." So the idea is the hunter was successful, we have enough to eat, we're back in unity with nature. And in this the divine shines. I call this nature mysticism. It's important because it's so modern, so widespread. I'll describe this nature mysticism with a slogan, and it is "Back to Holy Unity."
Die Idee ist die, zur heiligen Einheit. Man könnte auch Heinheit mit HI, weil der heilige Hein.
The idea is that there's something redeemed in nature, holy.
Die Idee ist die, dass in der Natur was
And already in the Romantic period, nature is lifted to something religious and mystical.
In der Romantik schon wird Natur auf einmal religiös und mystisch überhöht.
As a place of longing for those who say we're fed up with a grand worldview, with that stuff, but we want to go back. By the way, even when you Google it, it's an astoundingly strong movement. Paganism isn't racism. And I don't know, we've always stayed pagans, this new paganism movement. But deeper down, even with those who wouldn't call themselves pagans, a surprising amount of people believe that the true place of spirituality is in the deep forest. And I feel closer to the eternal there. Again, as with everything, there's for sure some truth to it, but it also has its weird sides to it. We can perhaps look closer at it later. Now, for a mystical school that is probably not so familiar to you, but I said it earlier, that there are mystical branches in every major religion, including Islam. Islam overall presents itself to us with a strong worldview. So you could say there are clear beliefs and you need to do certain things. The whole mystical quality or mystical history of Islam is controversial, even within Islam itself. But this mysticism is called Sufism. Sufism. There aren't that many Sufis. But that which exists from Sufism is remarkable for one reason, because it's a flaming, in love with God mysticism. I'm telling you, if you are a Christian and you're looking at all these paths, the first and, as I find, arrogant response can be to say, because there's a wrong title on it, it must all be wrong. But if you look closer, you realize in some ways they are extremely similar to us. How you process this with your own worldview, why that's the case is another question. But it's first of all interesting that there is a movement that says, I take the Quran. In it are written a lot of difficult things and harsh and violent things, but deep down I have a sense of a lover. When you read Sufi mysticism, you find a language I could only describe as erotic. So I am so in love with you, God. Since I first saw you, my senses fainted, and I can no longer think clearly. These things. We might look at part of that over the course of this series. There are poets like Rumi and many others who have an astoundingly loving, you could almost say erotic revelation of God. As before, I'll just read you a short quote again. In my heart, all thoughts revolve around you. My tongue speaks nothing but of my love for you. When I turn to the east, you shine on me in the east. When I look to the west, there you are before me. You are the fullness in everything, yet you don't fade like we do. You are my heart, my conscience, my thought, my spirit. You're the rhythm of my breathing. You are the knot of my heart. Here again we can say, okay, I didn't know people talked about God like that if they weren't Christians. Yeah, it's true. In Sufism, you definitely have an extreme sense that God is love and God actually desires a loving relationship with us. At the same time, the Sufi path is extremely ascetic. It's about abstinence. It's partially about strange bodily rituals to put yourself in trance. I'll call this path erotic asceticism. By this I don't mean asceticism towards erotic love, but I mean a deep focus on experiencing the love of God, a spiritual path that gives itself over to intense abstinence. Sufism. And finally, last but not least, probably what you're most familiar with, Christian mysticism. Christian mysticism has similarities to the other ones and yet is very different in deciding places. I think this will become clear. I've wondered how to title Christian mysticism, but I thought about what a nuance it is if you read many different teachers. Here from the Eastern Church, over to Catholic mystics, Carmelite mysticisms, all the way to Puritan mysticism from the Protestants. To me, one of the key words is learning to love. So the mindset that it's in essence not about the experience itself, nor is it about emptying oneself, that it's also not about a union or intense experience. But in the end, it's about learning to love in a holistic way. I claim this is the essence to which Christian mysticism, learning to love, can be boiled down to, the title it could carry.
Lieben, lernen, reduzieren oder womit es sich überschreiben ließe.
Have you noticed there are no ads on this channel? This is the only one. There's one reason for that. This channel is funded by donations only. If you want to help us to continue with this work, you find everything about supporting us below in the description. Now enjoy the rest of the video.
What I find fascinating is that across all these traditions, very similar truths assert themselves. And you will never guess how many truths those are. Right, 5 truths, 5 revelations. And this is anything but self-evident. But it shows me that there's clearly a godly way of teaching which even works when people don't know that they are dealing with a God, or how exactly they're in relationship with God at the moment. I'll show you these revelations for one main reason. I'm about to tell you a story that influenced me more in how I deal with this topic than many others. It was not too long ago, a little over a year ago. I was flying home from the US on a very uncomfortable Delta flight. And next to me sat a young Asian woman. I was tired and actually wasn't in the mood for conversation. I'm not usually the type to talk about random things with people on every flight. But in that moment, it was easy because she had sat down next to me and was reading a book on philosophy. Normally, you don't see people sitting next to you who are reading philosophy. And I had glanced over a bit at a section about Christian philosophy. And then she took a break and I asked her, "Hey, do you study philosophy or are you interested in Christianity?" From there an interesting conversation started. She said that she, a Chinese woman, grew up without religion, but still found many questions come up, which is why she started studying philosophy. And it was why she was about to become a Buddhist. And she told me of her spiritual teacher and all the things she had learned. And these 5 points I'm about to mention. I was astounded that she had started learning about Buddhism as an atheist, and there were significant points where I'd say they are very similar to my faith, up to a certain point. And in this one point, I'll tell you later what it was, we suddenly thought, wow, the paths are quite different here. But because I was allowed to listen first, and because there were so many things we could first discover, yeah, true, very similar revelation, there was an atmosphere where you could say without being pushy or, "But I'm right." See, and this is the point where the path Jesus teaches is like this. Do you get a bit of what I mean? If I had said right away, "Oh my, atheist family and Buddhist," well, I can't deal with that because I'm a Christian or something. Not only would conversation have been impossible, but neither she nor I would have learned anything. I'll share with you 5 truths that are relatively deep and of which I so hope that when you meet people, be they in esoteric or one of these other paths, when you realize they get something, that you wouldn't immediately judge them, but say that they understood something. It doesn't have to be the full path. We're all on a journey. But here you understood something important. And the first revelation mystics have across all religions is the material world isn't the main thing. It's not the only thing, and it's not the highest thing. Many people don't even get that, okay? For them, the highest goal is just, well, material things aren't all that matters. Whether you meet someone who just came back from their Tai Chi seminar or whatever, people who sense that there's not just material things, but that there is something spiritual beyond it, you can congratulate people from the heart and say that's an important base intuition, because in this direction the path actually continues. Material stuff really isn't the highest thing. With astonishing regularity, no matter what the religion teaches in its words, the people who set out on a deeper mystical journey often land, shockingly often, at the intuition that God is love. Here again I can introduce you another time to a Hindu mystic who fasted for a very long time, and one day it came to him, actually, there's only one God, and He is love. Okay, like that. And the Sufis and many others too. With Zen it's maybe a little more difficult because they don't directly believe in a God. In Hasidism and Kabbalah, the same idea. Nowhere in the Old Testament does it say God is love. But in this mystical side of Judaism, God is regularly addressed in song as lover of the soul, come, O my bridegroom. So this intuition, God is love, is found surprisingly often with people or cultures who get into a mystical path. I'll read you a nice quote from an anonymous book, The Cloud of Unknowing. It's an English book from the Middle Ages, Christian mysticism. For love can reach all the way to God in this life, but the ability to understand cannot. That would be a classic sentence of a mystic. Knowledge alone won't take you to God, but only love. People can reach up to this point. It doesn't mean that they can walk this path from their own strength, but there is this revelation. But also surprisingly common is the understanding that something separates us from God. Some people say that's only a Christian thing, they give people a bad conscience. No, it's not just the Christians. People who go on a spiritual journey discover that something in their heart isn't right. And I'll call this revelation impurity of the heart. With that I don't even mean I broke a rule and get rid of your bad conscience, then you'll feel better. I don't mean that, but an experienced knowledge that something doesn't fit right. The esoterics would say you caught impurities through negative waves or negative energies. Others would say it's a negative karma. In all these paths, there's a search for how can I become pure from what weighs on me. The things that separate me, things that stand between me and the truth or me and God. The next revelation, which is especially strong in Eastern religion, but also Sufism and Jewish mysticism, you also see it in part with pagans, but it's this revelation. I'll call it letting go. Very strong in the esoteric movement, but a true revelation that we hold on to things that aren't good for us. Like it's a basic understanding you can recognize with many of these authors or in these movements. And now comes something interesting. After that, we'll work a little with these revelations. Zen Buddhism. You want to become a Zen monk? Probably not. But you go to meditate. If the problem is, if you can only reach a certain point alone, then you need a master. And this master must be further along than you. In yoga, it's the same. In Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, it's the same thing. Very often in mystical religions, especially in yoga and also in Hinduism, that you need a master who does something here, who somehow takes away your debt, who brings you to another level. In esoterics as well, all times your own karma or negative energy, you can't get rid of it. You need a master above you, the necessity of a master. And finally, we Christians also believe that you need a master, that you can't do this from your own strength. Let's look at this closer. The necessity of a master. Here I sat with my Chinese conversation partner on the Delta flight, and she told me that her master, who was about to initiate her into Buddhism, was a wonderful man. And she trusted him fully. And our conversation took an interesting turn right at this moment, because she had fallen in love with a young man. And she said, I love him so much, and actually I want to be with him. But my master said, no, you're truly called to meditation and abstinence, and you should separate from him. And she was pulled back and forth by what her master had said. He had said, a relationship is a hindrance for you because it's all about letting go of all things. That's classic Buddhist mysticism, that dependence is some kind of an obstacle. But here was the feeling in her heart that love was important. And suddenly there was an open door where I said, I would like to tell you about my master. Because with my master, those two concepts aren't only not enemies, but inseparable. You can only love God if you love your neighbor in the right way. And love isn't ever the problem for God, but rather the path I'm walking on is not that you end up in nothingness. It's an in-between step to let go of things, but it's about practicing how to love. Here there would be more of a path to love the young man, but learn to love him right. And suddenly in our conversation that started with mysticism and Buddha, and where we just talked a half hour about all the wonderful stuff we discovered, suddenly it was as if Jesus stood right in the middle of our conversation with absolute necessity. As if this conversation was leading to the question, who is this master? Who can take me further in this place, where my life is divided in these two topics? All that would not have been possible if we hadn't previously gone that stretch together. And see, in all these mystical movements, in all these revelations, all these paths, there are still some problems no one can get around. And you've already guessed how many problems they are. There are at least 5 problems. Probably more. But these 5 problems are in the way of every mystical path. And you can talk with any person, every Hindu, every pagan, every Odin friend, or any Sufi follower, or whatever. You can talk about these 5 topics. You can say in all the things you've already discovered there is still a problem, isn't there? Or how do you see it? And with all these questions, it will in the end be measured. The first question is, what about normal life? With that I mean the same question I could ask the Chinese lady. You do your meditations, that's great. But how does this mystical path relate to your normal, successful life? And there are mystical paths that have no answer to that. They just say you need to let go of it. You're just doing this part-time and only seeking a mystical experience, but it has nothing to do with daily life. And I would say, here we have a problem. Somehow these things need to come together. I have a second question, and it's addressed, for example, to Sufism, but also Christian mysticism, actually to many things. All this love stuff and God is love, how does that fit with the strict side of God? At least in Islam we see this, in Christianity, in Judaism also. How does this go together with the strict side of God? Where God is also a king, and God is also Lord. The next one is quite intense. Maybe the most relevant for the esoteric movement. In esoterics, this is mostly a shortcut of one of those mystical paths. One thing hardly has room. It's quite something. And it's the question of objective guilt. When you feel guilty, you can do a seminar how to reconcile with your soul child or how you can get back in positive waves. But if you say, you really betrayed your wife, you really lied to that guy, you really did something bad, it seems to me that this is also a difficult point in Buddhism. They do have something like you shouldn't answer with violence. But what about objective guilt? It isn't taken away just because we say, let's pretend it never happened. Or modern esoteric paths. I don't know if you know Eckhart Tolle. Live in the now. If you don't know it, that means you live in a Christian bubble, because outside of that, a lot of people know him. Or look in the US at Oprah Winfrey. A lot of teaching, you need to let go of your past, send it back to the cosmos and live in the now. There's some truth to living in the here and now, but the question is, if you really did something in the past. I don't want to be mean, but imagine you're a war criminal and you killed a lot of people. I would be glad if someone told me live in the now and forget what was yesterday. So this can be a total lie. So what do I do with objective guilt? This live in the now and just observe how you're doing and come back into harmony, it can also be a total denial of objective guilt. And sooner or later the heart knows this. The last 2 points I'll share are the most dense and difficult. See here. Across all fairy tales, there's not just the old wise man, the mystic or white sorcerer. There's also this character. Those of you who know Lord of the Rings know him. It's Saruman. This Saruman also exists in thousands of other tales. Saruman starts as a good sorcerer. Or the Jedi Knights in Star Wars. And in all fairy tales, someone starts as a good sorcerer, but at some point it goes click and they become evil. Despite all their wisdom and efforts. And when does it turn evil? It turns evil when they want to use their power for themselves. I titled one of the basic revelations as letting go. And I think in each mystical path, everyone reaches the question, do you really want to let go? Or do you, through mysticism and your spirituality, actually want to stay powerful in the end and look good? And this point decides if you become a good or evil sorcerer. I'll call this problem the power question. You know, in each mystical path, there's also this thing we call magic. You know what magic is? Magic is an attempt to use spiritual things in order to manipulate others. The tough part is that works. That's another one of those things where we say we don't like that experience, so we cut it out. There is magic, voodoo, call it what you want, in thousands of cultures around the world. And you need to cut out and ignore mountains of experiences from human history and humans living reality if you believe this doesn't exist. Mysticism and a spiritual path are real, but it goes hand in hand with an understanding, with power. And the question goes even deeper. Do I use this power for myself? Or do I learn to let go in a deeper way? This letting go deeper is also taught in other religions. But I don't know how a human heart can even resist this temptation to in the end use it for themselves after all. There aren't just good sorcerers, but also the bad sorcerers, which means the greater problem in the end is, who is the master? Now you might say, okay, but what if no one is my master? If I'm just my own master, if I go my own way?
Wenn ich einfach meinen eigenen Weg gehe?
If you go your own way, you make your own ego your master. And that's more deceptive. You see, if we assume that the real problem is inside, then my own ego is the problem. And I say I'll find my own path, then it's like I'm stuck in a swamp. And so I'm the only one who can pull myself out. You see the paradox? That, friends, is the most common mystical belief in our modern times. That's why much of what exists in the esoteric movement is a cheap version of real mysticism. Because real mysticism, like Zen Buddhism, is quite difficult. You need to truly submit to your master. Real mysticism in yoga is difficult because you must submit to your master. A quick seminar on reading a book isn't dangerous. But friends, all that can become a system that just confirms your own worldview and your own ego. And you install your own ego as master and basically make yourself like God. You have to come a bit to the abstract level with me when I show you this. But in the last 100 to 200 years, there's been a number of figures, and they tend to become increasingly frequent, who write things like, "We no longer follow a certain religion, but we pick out from all religions the best essence of all paths." One person, for example, who tried that was Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophism. He says, all the religions, they said right stuff, and I'll now give you a full view of it. And it sounds so tolerant at first. It sounds like truth is everywhere, and I'll show you how it fits together. But actually crazy what that really says. The one who can order it all is me. In our current time, again, if you don't know this person, it doesn't mean that they are unknown. It just means you live in a certain bubble. Don't know who of you knows him, that's Ken Wilber. He wrote many books. There's a whole movement in the US, Spiritual Dynamics, which says spiritualities or religions develop in a similar way to evolution. And you can see how the individual religions have evolved. And in the end, you could say spirituality works such and such ways. There's different versions, and you can choose what suits you. What's wild is he's actually saying this teacher says this, that teacher says that, that teacher says that, and here's a throne, and on the throne I sit. And I'll tell you, each of these teachers, well, you're okay, yeah, you understood something, but only from my point of view, my watch, do I see truth. I don't accuse him of doing this consciously, but what he's really saying is he puts himself in the place of the master of all masters. And that is actually the place of God. And I meet people all the time who say to me, well, I already dealt with this type of mysticism and that type too. I took all that and put something together for myself. I have really bad news for you. You can only serve one master. You can only walk one path. You can only live one life. Each of these paths requires total submission. You can repent from one thing. You can't say, I walked that way, now I'll walk another way. But you can't walk two ways at once. You also can take a new path each year. Eventually, the surrender in your heart won't be real anymore. Almost every one of these paths, if you look closely, requires you to fully commit to it. With Jesus in the most explicit way. Of all the wise teachers, I find Jesus the most intolerant, but also at least one of the clearest. Jesus doesn't leave an opinion to say, hey, 20% of me and 30% of someone else. He says, sorry, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But you need to understand what path you're standing on. It says in this story that he says, you will follow a master. That people think they're just doing whatever comes to their mind and they're free in that. That's actually not true. Each person follows something, either follows what their parents said or what society says, or their own habits or their moods. But each person follows someone. No one is that autonomous, so they only ever decide on their own. So in the end there is this question, and in the end it was also the question in the conversation on that Delta flight. How do you recognize a true master? What would they have to look like? He would have to have a real answer to the question what all the mystical questions have to do with normal life. He would have to have an answer to how God's strict side, God's judgment, is reconciled to his loving side. Or call it what you want to. The karma law in Buddhism is also something extremely merciless, even if God doesn't explicitly appear in it. Or they'd need to have an answer to, how do I get rid of guilt? If she had told me, I don't know, I killed someone and something like that, how do you meditate that away? You might be able to meditate away the feeling of guilt, but not the guilt itself. It's like taking pain medication while your wound is still bleeding. You can do that, but it doesn't solve the problem. That's objective guilt. And finally, the power question. At the end of the day, the question is which teacher you surrender to. They all teach you should let go, but who takes the lead? Are they a good master who deserves your trust? Because there's also the other kind. We saw it earlier. I'm reaching the end. We will deal in this series with mysticism in a more detailed way, but even just this understanding, it exists in all religions. They all recognize in several points quite similar things, ask similar questions, even just from that 5 truth result for us Christians. You're amazed that it's 5. 5 revelations we need to face. I already asked you in the beginning, do you want to learn something new or are you only here to feel affirmed? These are challenges. Because you're dealing with this topic and are a Christian, you will be challenged. You can tell it's not so easy. First thing is, when you look at Christianity, the way it particularly is in the West, compare it with other religions, especially in the East. Or if you compare Christianity today with Christianity around 1,000 years ago, then you have to say we've lost mysticism. Some authors call this process, which has been happening in Europe since the 1500s, the disenchantment. This idea we've actually solved all problems. We can trust our minds. We have a system to fit everything in. And I would claim that all that hasn't passed Christianity without leaving its mark. And I also claim that the Reformation was a great accelerator of this process. The Reformation, with its strong emphasis on choice and word, made an unholy alliance with Renaissance thinking, with the emerging modern age idea of science.
Vorstellung von Wissenschaft.
And the result was that already in the 17th and 18th century, an overly mind-focused, rationally based version of Christianity hit the market, which left a vacuum across large parts of Christianity. The Catholics have caught up in many ways. Across vast parts, Western Christianity has an overemphasis of the mind, not holistic, dry, not based on experience, disenchanted. I'm just saying that to spread some negative moods here. I'll call it disenchantment. I also believe, friends, that we live in a time where people increasingly long for experience.
Nach Erfahrung sehnen, dass sie, schau mal,
See, sometimes the time in which we live is called the postmodern age. But actually, we've lived for the past 500 years in a time where everything worked with the mind, everything worked with control. We built computers, we built machines to control things, where everything works with technology and is predictable. There's no more room for mystery, no more room for enchantment, and it becomes more and more bleak and boring. And actually, people cry out more and more for what Max Horkheimer said, as far as I know, in a famous interview. Actually, an atheist philosopher, he called it the desire for the very different thing. Friends, people in our culture increasingly long for the very different thing, but they don't find it in Christianity. But in Christianity, they find equally sensible books and some texts and head-overload things, and not this holistic, enchanted depth, this mystical thing they're looking for. And I claim this is a severe problem. Second revelation for Christians. I don't want to see it anymore that so many Christians are afraid of esoteric people. I'll tell you something. If someone is truly searching, no matter where they search, they're much closer to truth than someone who isn't searching at all. And there are people who grew up in church but are nothing at all. They don't search one bit, but they just made themselves comfortable. And I think the spiritual search of people is firstly a reason to celebrate. If someone is searching somewhere and says, I've read books, tell them how cool that you're on your way, how great that you want to learn, how great that you're open. I've heard it several times from friends of mine who do cool stuff, like going to the streets and just praying for people or praying for prophetic words. And they say they go to an esoteric convention and also do that. The difference is just that the people there are much more open than most Christians for whom they pray. Now you might say, wait, how does that fit with my model? Well, sure, if you're open, you can be open to anything, in the sense of you might catch negative energies for yourself. But the openness for God is a very high value. So once again, the question, are you here to learn something or just to be affirmed? Spiritual search, I'll call this just searching, is positive. It's quite interesting how Jesus handles these kind of things. I'll just give you two examples. Once Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, and then they have a sort of dialogue. And one guy just says the right answer. Jesus doesn't then ask, how does it look in your life? Is everything else okay? Do you know the whole belief system? He just sees the attempt and responds to it. When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." How would it be if we responded to people in that way? It's not always about judging things, this is right, this is wrong. If you say that you answer with reason, I see you are thinking about this, you're not far from the kingdom of God. I think this has a very human side, Jesus' response. Or this incredible parable. What would this mean for our dealing with other worldviews and paths? This parable that a sower sows good seed and then an enemy comes to spread bad seed. And then someone says, come, let's pull it all out. But the farmer says, both grow until the harvest. When the time of harvest then comes, I'll say to the workers, first collect the weeds and tie them into bundles to burn them, and bring the other part to my barn. I like this statement. Take a close look what Jesus says in the parable. This, let both grow. This is a God who is able to say, I don't need to control everything from the start. Some things need to grow and then it will show which parts bring fruit. It's not all the same. Jesus doesn't say it doesn't matter what grows. It brings different fruit, but some things need to reveal themselves over time. But there's an allowance there, a wideness in the kingdom of God. And finally, if you have a real problem with people like that and esoteric people and magicians, there were once 3 guys that came from far away. And amazingly, they were the first ones to recognize Jesus. And you know what they are called in the Greek? Magoi. Sorry, no, not kings, not saints either. And also not Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar. I don't know, maybe. They were 3 magicians. Now don't ask me how that fits together, but here it doesn't even say that they were Jews. They were magicians. They calculated constellations and somehow realized that this is Jesus. What does that say, friends, about God? That when He becomes human, He allows the first people who discover Him to be, we don't know if they were Jews. Could theoretically be possible that people who interpret the stars and through the most wild paths stumble on the fact that this is the Messiah? Could it be that our God allows Himself to be found in the wildest ways? And by no means am I saying that there's a path apart from Jesus. I don't want to be misunderstood there. But how the Lord goes on a journey with people is amazing, and often amazingly generous, often more generous than we Christians are. In closing, but if it's true that each religion can become a system, a worldview that shields me off from growth and blocks true revelation, so I'll make myself comfortable in my worldview. Friends, then we Christians are not at all exempt from that. And actually there is this risk already all over the New Testament. Paul says it a bit more flowery. He expresses it differently in Galatians. He says, you have begun in the Spirit and now want to end in the flesh. I'll call this the risk of falling back into religion. I'll explain what I mean. I'll now use the term religion in a Protestant sense, so a negative sense, where religion means it's my system where I try to become righteous through my own laws. And actually, the core of what God wants is always a process of transformation and change. But friends, you can make yourselves comfortable at any level of faith. Now I know it all. Now I have my routines. Every day I do such and such. And it can become a replacement of a daily path. There's no reason why we Christians should be immune to this risk. The last 2 points. We saw earlier that each of these paths teaches that you need a master. What would you say marks a true master? A true master is always someone who themselves had a true master, who has experience. You can't read it in a book. And here's a true thorn, a real catch for us Christians. In the conversation with Nicodemus, Jesus is a little hard on Nicodemus. He says to him, "You are Israel's teacher and do not understand these things? Very truly I tell you, we speak of what we know and we testify to what we have seen." It means Jesus says to Nicodemus, "You are clearly a teacher who doesn't know anything." We, however, he speaks of himself, "I speak of what I see." Friends, only experienced people can teach in mysticism. Only experienced people can be a master. And that's the real challenge. When someone authentically longs for a spiritual path, for spirituality, they will find out who has walked that path themselves and who hasn't. And there's nothing that turns people off more than someone who just studied or teaches somewhere or has an office but never walked that path on the inside. They won't go there. They will go somewhere else. And that, friends, is a fact that goes for all of us. If people can't find these rabbis, these saints, these monks with us, they will just look in the neighborhood. Only experienced, by that I don't mean academic, I don't mean been a member long enough. It doesn't matter what title is on your name tag. Have you walked the path yourself? Have you been a student? Have you yourself submitted to a master? Did you experience something for years and practice it? Or is it just blah, blah, blah? These people who search for mysticism are interested in a path, interested in this. And this, I think, is where the Lord puts His finger in the wound of Western Christianity, who have a huge head but a really small heart. Where there's a lot of money, a lot of power, much intellectual knowledge involves, but little experience, little mysticism, and therefore so little comes across, hardly shines and attracts few people. Only experienced people can teach. I'm not saying that theology isn't important, but these spiritual things can only be taught by people who have walked that journey themselves. And the last revelation is equally uncomfortable for us Christians. Friends, it's always easier to know something. I mentioned this point. To know something is more comfortable than holistic change. You can get stuck at each step of your spiritual life and know everything for the rest of your life. All the right answers, knowing how it is with politics, knowing how it used to be, knowing what that person said, knowing what it says in the Bible, and it becomes a replacement for sustainable change. A holistic, true transformation shows itself in your life, nowhere else. The rest is just blah blah. In that, our Jewish mystical friends are right. Knowledge. You will realize there just are people, there are Christians who just want to know. And then there's those who are willing to go on a path of holistic transformation, and that never stops. Knowledge or transformation. Friends, mysticism isn't some freak topic, but it's the center of Christianity. Everything else is just stabilization of your ego. In Hosea, God exclaims, what I truly want isn't just your burnt offerings. It's not your outside things that you give money, that you do your stuff, but I want to be known. It's a path of personal revelation. I don't just mean knowledge. There are people who read books about everything. Yeah, I know that, I know it already. No, holistic transformation humbles you, changes your ego. You don't emerge as the winner. In this race, there are no winners. There are only transformed people, those who want to learn something. In the end, the thing that matters to God always has to do with your heart. He says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. There are so many corrupted forms of spirituality. People start getting weird, people get strange, turn magical, and some people turn ice cold. There are people who are religious and cold, and they know everything, but you just can't stand them anymore. What kind of faith is that? What kind of mysticism is that? It's certainly not the authentic kind and not from Jesus. I asked you a question at the start, and it's the question I want to ask you at the end. Do you really want to learn anything? Or do you just want to be affirmed in what you already know? As children, we still have this ability, and so the only way back is to the beginning. Jesus says, you can't even get into the kingdom of God if you don't become like a child. And so the beginning and the end of each mystical path is to become a disciple, a child, to learn, to say I haven't understood anything at all. Francis of Assisi said at the very end of his life, "Brothers, we will begin, for up to now we have hardly done anything." That's the heart of a true disciple. Let us say with this willingness tonight, I want to really learn. I will not stay still and always in the same circles. I think in my mind what I already know. Real life confronts you with experiences that cost your ego something. And it's good that way, because your ego is fallen, so your own ego can't save you. Luckily, there's someone who can save you. Let's stand up and pray. Hey, you watched to the end of this video. Congratulations. I hope you could take something from it. I'll be grateful to you if you like this video and subscribe to our channel. You can also follow me on Instagram, Dr. Johannes Hartl. There we can stay in touch. Until next time, all the best.